It was a cold and rainy night in Ravenwood, a small town in northern Montana, where the wooden houses creaked with the sound of the wind and the deserted streets were blanketed in a fog that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Thomas, a newcomer to the town, had joined a party at the old mansion in the village center. It was a typical weekend gathering, full of laughter, low music, and casual conversations. But something about that place felt off. The mansion, an imposing building with large windows and heavy curtains, looked like the kind of place that held more history than the residents themselves could imagine. It didn't take long before Thomas, after some time observing, felt the need for a break. He got up from the table and looked for a quieter spot to relax. But before he could find a peaceful corner, the need to use the bathroom led him to a small door at the back of the house. Thomas didn't know what compelled him to take that path, but there he was, walking down a narrow and dimly lit hallway. Instead of a bathroom, he found something completely different: a wooden staircase descending into a dark, stuffy basement. The air grew denser as he got closer, and the chill intensified. Curiosity pushed him forward, and he went down the steps, thinking it might just be a storage space, maybe a secluded room for those seeking a bit of privacy. However, as he descended, the house's light barely reached the basement. The muffled sound of music and party chatter faded as he ventured deeper into the dark space. The smell of mold and old wood grew stronger. The floor was covered in thick, worn rugs, and the atmosphere was so damp that even the wooden walls seemed warped by time. Everything in the basement looked like it had been abandoned for years, yet somehow the space was perfectly intact, as if it was a secret no one dared to uncover. Thomas hesitated, looking around in the shadows, but his urge to relieve himself pushed him onward. Yet, as he moved toward a corner of the basement, his steps were halted by a noise, something dragging across the floor. He froze, tense, listening. The sound seemed to come from a distant direction, deep in the basement, as if something or someone was moving in the darkness. Taking a deep breath, he followed the noise, thinking it might be an animal, perhaps a rat or some other wild creature, but something told him otherwise. A shiver ran up his spine. When he reached the far end of the basement, he noticed a small, almost imperceptible door that was slightly ajar. The wood was worn, and it looked like someone had tried to hide it a long time ago. Curiosity now outweighed fear, and Thomas, with no other options, pushed the door open. As he did, a small room revealed itself. The strangest part wasn't the room itself, but what he saw inside. The walls were covered in drawings, but they weren't ordinary drawings. They were strange symbols, with intertwining lines forming figures that looked almost human. And there was something else, something that made him hesitate. In one corner, there was an old, rusted wooden chair, and next to it, a large, broken mirror. Even in pieces, the mirror reflected the light from his flashlight in a strange way, making the shadows in the basement seem to move, as if they were alive. It was then that Thomas saw something that made his blood run cold. In the distorted reflection, he saw what looked like a shadow, a tall, indistinct figure moving behind him. He spun around quickly, but no one was there. The silence in the basement was deafening, and the sound of the party now felt like a distant memory. What he didn't know was that by opening that door, he had awakened something that had been trapped in that basement for a very long time. Something ancient and forgotten that fed on curiosity and fear. That house held more history than he could ever imagine, and that basement, hidden deep below, was where the things best left unremembered were kept. He tried to leave, but his steps grew heavier, as if the basement itself were trying to hold him back. The air thickened, and the sensation of being watched became almost unbearable. When Thomas finally tried to climb the stairs to escape, he realized the door he'd entered through was now locked. He was trapped, Panic overtook his mind. He turned back toward the broken mirror, and what he saw reflected made his heart race. The shadow in the mirror, now more defined, was there, grinning at him grotesquely. He knew he was no longer alone in the basement. With fear mounting, Thomas began pounding on the door in desperation, but there was no response. The party above now seemed like a distant world, and he was sinking deeper into the darkness of the basement, where something was waiting. And he knew he couldn't escape so easily. Something had been awakened, and now he was part of the story, one that few in Ravenwood would dare to tell. The Ravenwood basement was never just a basement. It was a refuge for what lay beyond understanding, and Thomas had been chosen to become part of something far greater than he could ever imagine. It was a cold autumn night in Hollow Creek, a small, isolated town in the heart of Missouri. The sky was overcast, and a light rain fell, creating a dark and melancholic atmosphere. Most residents were already indoors, warming themselves by their fireplaces, while the town's streets remained empty, except for the occasional car passing through. However, there was one place on the outskirts of Hollow Creek that always gave the locals the chills: an old, abandoned house, isolated at the end of a dirt road. The house was massive, its Victorian structure decayed, and its roof partially collapsed. The windows were dusty and cracked, and the wooden doors hung loose, creaking with the strong wind that passed through the surrounding trees. The place had always been surrounded by stories of mystery and legends of unexplainable events. At night, the sounds coming from within were often whispered about by those brave enough to pass by. Whispers, slamming doors, even distant screams. But, without a doubt, what scared people most were the shadows seen even on moonless nights. Andrew, a curious young man from Hollow Creek, had always heard adults talk about the house with a mix of fear and fascination. His friends, more cautious, avoided even looking in its direction. But Andrew couldn't resist. He had to know what was going on in there. People spoke of the house as if it were cursed, but Andrew believed it was all just local superstition. That night, he decided to go alone. The rain grew heavier as he started down the dirt road. The wind howled, making the trees sway in an unsettling rhythm. But Andrew didn't turn back. He had a flashlight in hand and his heart was pounding, but his mind was resolute. He wanted to understand why everyone in Hollow Creek avoided that house. What could be so terrifying? When he arrived at the edge of the property, the house's front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Inside, the house was cold and dark. The smell of mold was nearly unbearable, and the sound of water dripping from the broken roof filled the silence. Andrew turned on his flashlight and cautiously stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath his feet with every step, and the feeling of being watched quickly settled in. The house was empty, but as he looked around, he felt something still lingered, something unseen, but present and waiting. He walked through narrow hallways, past furniture buried in dust, and ripped curtains swaying in the breeze. Each corner seemed darker than the last, and the air grew heavier with tension. Suddenly, he heard a noise from upstairs, a muffled, dragging sound. At first, Andrew thought it might be the wind or an animal, but the sensation that he wasn't alone intensified by the second. With his heart racing, he climbed the creaking stairs. Every step echoed through the house, amplifying the feeling of being watched closely. At the top, he saw a partially open door down the hall. His flashlight lit the entrance of a dark, empty bedroom. But then, he noticed something strange. At the far end of the room, near the wall, something moved, a shadow. He blinked, thinking he was imagining things, but the shadow moved again, this time closer. Andrew stepped back, but before he could react, the sound of a door slamming downstairs made him jump. Fear took over instantly. He looked back at the room, but the shadow was gone. Instead, he felt a chill down his spine, as if unseen eyes were watching him. He rushed down the stairs, but just as he reached the door, the sound of footsteps behind him made his skin crawl. He turned around, his flashlight trembling in his hands. The house was silent once more, but he knew something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but he could feel it. Something was there, closer than ever. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut, locking him inside. The click of the latch echoed in the darkness, escalating his panic. Andrew tried the door, but it wouldn't budge. He looked for a window, but all were either shattered or jammed. Panic fully set in. Then, he heard whispers, words he couldn't understand, coming from deep inside the house. Where were they coming from? Suddenly, his flashlight died, plunging him into complete darkness. The feeling of being surrounded overwhelmed him. He knew someone, or something, was with him, moving silently. The sound of muffled breathing made him freeze. When he managed to turn the flashlight back on, the beam revealed a tall, pale figure standing at the end of the hallway, a shadow seemingly pulled from the very walls of the house. Its eyes locked onto Andrew, but he couldn't move. The figure began to approach slowly, and Andrew tried to back away, but his feet felt glued to the floor. Paralyzed by fear, he didn't know what to do. Just as the figure was about to reach him, a thunderous noise came from outside, like a door being violently flung open. The figure vanished, and the pressure in his chest began to ease. Andrew ran for the door, now miraculously unlocked. He bolted into the pouring rain, never once looking back. When he finally reached home, breathless and soaked, he locked himself in his room, the echoes of that house still haunting his thoughts. He never told anyone what happened that night. Over time, the house became even more isolated, ignored by most. And in Hollow Creek, people still whisper about it, afraid, as if it's a place where time and reality twist. Who would dare to return?